As promised, I'm going to talk to you about De Vries' theory, evolution by mutation. His is very interesting because if you study it based on what you know about genetics, it kind of almost makes sense. So what we talked about with Darwin is that we couldn't find out where the new traits had come from. It had to come from genes, but Darwin and John Baptiste, they did not actually believe that the variation came from the genes. They believed that the variation just came from environmental factors. Well, at the time, we also said that the reason that they did this is because they didn't have as much research about genes and they did not know much about genes. Well, De Vries, he came about his theory when there was actually more knowledge about mutations and genetics. So he was a Dutch botanist. So a botanist studies plants. So he was studying plants and he proposed his mutation theory of evolution, which was the belief that mutations could produce the genetic changes needed for biological evolution. Well, he said this because he noticed that if there was a mutation in genes, then there was a mutation in the phenotype and the genetics of the plant. So he believed that if there was enough mutations, then you could have had this change from one kind of organism to another. But for biological evolution to take place, mutations must form new genes. Well, we see new genetic material when you see mutations in the genes, but the majority of these gene mutations that occur are somatic mutations, which takes place in the body cells. And we know that these somatic mutations, if they're in the body cells, they are not passed on to their offsprings. So therefore, they cannot contribute to biological evolution. The only mutations that could produce biological evolution would be germ cells. But most of our mutations are actually in somatic, not germ. Germ mutations that occur in cells that form gametes are the only mutations that could contribute to biological evolution. So this is what Hugo de Vries looked like. So what do we know about mutations? Well, mutations are actually harmful to organisms. So if mutations that can cause improvement, then biological evolution should take place in fruit flies, for example, that have a lot of mutations. So if we saw mutations and we saw an improvement, that would be biological evolution, because biological evolution believes that if you have a less complex organism and now you have a more complex organism. But we see that mutations are often harmful. They harm the organism. They don't make it better. So despite many mutations, the fruit flies have not evolved into improved flies, but they have been harmed by the mutation. We see mutations the most in fruit flies. That's why they're using this as an example. We never see a fruit fly evolve into another organism. So that's why an evidence that this mutation couldn't actually cause biological evolution. The evolution of organisms from a single cell millions of years ago to the diversity seen today would require gain-of-function mutation. Gain-of-function mutation would mean that the mutation would cause a more desirable trait in the organism. But most of the time what we see is a loss-of-function mutation, such as albinism. We talked about albinism being a mutation that causes the person to have less pigment in their skin. That would be a loss-of-function mutation, which is what we normally see. Scientists currently have no credible examples of mutations that have produced new genetic information to increase the complexity of organisms and form new kinds of organisms. So there's no evidence of these gain-of-function mutations. So therefore, we have no evidence that what Hugo believed was true. The last thing we have to talk about is the modern evolutionary theory. Well, they didn't actually accept De Vries' theory. Now scientists believe in this mutation selection theory. So this is called neo-Darwinism. Neo is a word that means new. So this is a combination of De Vries' mutation theory and Darwin's theory of natural selection. So we know, like I said, natural selection does happen. Those that can survive, the environment will survive, and therefore will produce offspring that have those same genes. And we also see DeVries, like DeVries said, mutations do form new genes, although they're mostly harmful. So they believe that mutations supply new traits. Okay, that is true. Organisms produce more offsprings than can survive. So again, the organisms produce more offspring that can survive because they're competing for resources like food and shelter. Natural selection allows only organisms with the best traits to survive. Well, here are the problems with those. It sounds good and it sounds right because we see that all three of those things do kind of happen. But here are the problems. Well, mutations can cause slight changes in existing structures, but they are unable to explain the development of structures. Think of how complex the eyeball is. Could you really believe that a bunch of mutations could cause a human eye that is so specific that if there's even one error, then you could either be colorblind if you have an error in the rods and cones, or the iris, you could have a problem, or you scratch the cornea of your eye and you can't see as well. There's so much complexity that how could a mutation really cause and develop this existing structure? Another problem would be that biological evolution by the mutation selection theory requires countless numbers of favorable mutations in exactly the right order, and the mutations in most, if not all of these organisms would have been unfavorable. So what this is saying is that over time you have all of these mutations that happen in an organism which produce this new organism. Well, this mutation, there would have to be millions of mutations that happen over time that happen, and they were all favorable mutations, meaning they're favorable, so that means they produce a more desirable trait. But what we see is that most of our trait mutations create unfavorable things. Think about the mutation in the number of chromosomes 21, creating Down syndrome. Or we have a mutation creating albinism, or a mutation in the blood creating sickle cell. All of these mutations I just mentioned are unfavorable. We don't really ever see a favorable mutation, but all of these mutations must have happened in order for neo-Darwinism to be true. It also requires natural environments that favor the evolving organism, and an environment that would be favorable for such partially evolved animals is also very unlikely. So that means that as the organism is evolving, there must have been an environment that was favorable for the partially evolved, or the one that did not yet have the desirable traits. So the environment must not only have been must not also been favorable for the fully developed organism, but also for this organism that is partially developed and becoming the desirable trait. So right now they're showing these two animals and they're saying, well, what would the evolving stage between these two animals looked like, and could it have survived while it was continuing to evolve and compete for resources in its environment? Some evolutionists promote a theory known as gradualism, which states that evolution occurs so slowly that it can't be observed in one person's lifetime. This has to be true because none of us have observed it. So that's saying that this is happening so slow that none of us will ever see it. It will happen in the next lifetime because it's so slow. Which I think is funny because that's how they keep you believing it, is because if you ever said, well, I've never seen anything evolve, well, they say, well, it happened so slowly that you could never observe it. It might be your great-great-grandchildren that will observe it, but you'll never see it in your lifetime. Other evolutionists have a different theory, though. This is called punctuated equilibrium. It says that at certain times, evolution occurs very rapidly, and at other times, almost no evolution takes place. So right now, we could be in the part of punctuated equilibrium that no evolution is taking taking place. And before, when all of the organisms that created human beings, it could have happened super rapidly. And now we're at this part of the evolutionary period where evolution isn't taking place at all. But now, neither gradualism nor punctuated equilibrium actually solves the many problems associated with mutation selection theory, such as the gain-of-function mutations. Some scientists, though not creationists, oppose certain aspects of evolutionism, so they promote the theory called intelligent design. This theory proposes that living things show such complexity that they could not have evolved by chance. So there must have been an intelligent designer that did form these organisms, but then some evolution happened after that. These intelligent design supporters believe that there was an intelligent outside force at the beginning that was responsible for the design seen in nature, but then everything else evolved. All right, that's all that I have for you. This is about an 11-minute video. I hope it wasn't too long, but I hope you have a good rest of your day and found some of this interesting.